The morning her father sold her, Mei Lin was sitting on the cold ground near the doorway of their house, watching a line of ants carry crumbs across the earthen floor. She was 16 years old. Her legs had not worked properly since she was 3, and she had long since stopped thinking about them the way other people did. Legs were things other people had. She had her arms, her mind, and her stubbornness, and she had decided years ago that those 3 things were enough. The village of Changpu was small and poor, and had always been small and poor. It sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by dry fields that gave a little grain in good years, and almost nothing in bad ones. The houses were made of packed earth and gray brick. The rooftops leaked when it rained. Most families kept a few chickens and a pig or 2, and the children ran barefoot through the dust until they were old enough to carry baskets and pull weeds alongside their parents. Mei Lin had never been able to run barefoot through the dust, but she had watched other children do it from the time she was small, sitting in the doorway of the house while her older brothers and sister played in the lane outside. She had not cried about it, not after she was 4 or 5. By the time she was 6, she had understood, in the quiet, certain way that children understand difficult truths, that crying about the shape of your life does not change it. So she had stopped crying and started watching. She watched everything. She watched how her mother haggled with the grain merchant each autumn, pushing the price up by 2 or 3 coins by pretending she had already spoken to a different buyer. She watched how her eldest brother, Da Wei, avoided extra work by always being just busy enough with something else when their father appeared. She watched how the village head, an old man named Gao, controlled every meeting by asking questions instead of making statements, so no one could argue with him directly. She watched, and she learned, and she stored everything she learned in the careful, organized drawers of her memory. Her father, Lin Bao, was not a cruel man by the standards of his time and place. He worked hard. He did not drink to excess. He did not raise his hand to her mother. But he was a man who saw the world only in terms of what things cost and what they produced, and by that measure, Mei Lin had always come up short. She could not work a field. She could not carry water from the well. She could not climb ladders, or mend roofs, or do any of the physical tasks that filled each day in Changpu from sunrise to dark. She could cook, seated on the floor with pots arranged around her. She could mend clothes with remarkable speed. She could keep accounts, though her father did not know this because he had never thought to ask. But none of those things were what Lin Bao counted as real value. What he counted as real value was the weight a body could lift and the distance it could walk without complaint. So when the man from the eastern county arrived in Changpu that autumn, Lin Bao had listened very carefully to what he said. The man's name was Chung, and he worked for a landowner in Fuping County, a man everyone called Du Ye, which meant something like the master of the estate, though the title was not official. Cheng had come to Changpu, looking for help for the estate's household. They needed someone steady, he said. Someone who could manage small tasks and learn quickly. They would provide meals and a sleeping place. There would be no wages to start, but if the person worked well, things could improve. Lin Bao had said yes before Cheng had finished speaking. Then he went inside and told Mei Lin to pack her things. She had one small cloth bag. She put 2 pairs of clothes in it, the better pair folded on top, and a small square of mirror that had been her mother's. She put in a pencil and 3 sheets of paper she had saved from a notebook that had otherwise been used up. She put in a pair of cotton gloves she used to protect her palms when she moved across rough ground, and then she sat and looked at the bag for a long moment, and she thought about what was happening, and she did not cry. Her mother came in while she was sitting there. Her mother's name was Su Hua, and she was a woman who had spent her whole life being careful and quiet and doing what was needed without complaint. She sat down on the floor next to Mei Lin and put her hand over her daughter's hand and did not say anything for a while. Then Su Hua said, in a low voice, that the estate in Fuping was not a bad place. She had heard the name Du Ye before. He was known as a man who was fair to people who worked for him. She said this as if she had been preparing the words for several days, which she probably had. Mei Lin looked at her mother's face and understood everything that Su Hua was not saying. She understood that her mother had not chosen this. She understood that her mother was frightened and sorry. She understood that Su Hua was telling her this one piece of good news because it was the only useful thing she had to offer. Mei Lin put her free hand over her mother's and pressed it once. Then she picked up her bag. The cart that came for her arrived near evening. It was a plain wooden cart pulled by a mule that looked as tired as the man who drove it. The driver was a broad, silent man who did not give his name. He accepted something from Lin Bao, a small cloth package that made a soft, heavy sound when it changed hands, and then he gestured to the cart without looking at Mei Lin. She moved to the back of the cart on her palms and knees with the ease of long practice. She had developed a way of moving that was fast and smooth, and that most people found uncomfortable to watch, so most people looked away. The driver looked at the mule. Lin Bao had already gone back toward the house. Su Hua stood in the doorway, with both hands pressed together in front of her chest, and she was watching, and her face in the last of the evening light was very still. Mei Lin did not wave. She looked at her mother until the cart turned the corner, and her mother was no longer visible, and then she looked forward, into the dark road ahead, and she began counting the things she knew. She knew she was strong. She knew she was fast with her hands. She knew she could add numbers in her head faster than most people could with an abacus. She knew she could read, which most girls in Chengpu could not, because she had borrowed her brother's school books and taught herself while they were outside playing. She knew she did not frighten easily. She knew that wherever she was going, the people there had not yet decided what she was worth, which meant she still had the chance to show them. She counted these things quietly in the dark as the cart moved along the road, and by the time the driver stopped to rest the mule at a small crossroads shelter, she had finished her counting and made up her mind. She was going to be fine. The road to Fuping County took most of the night. The driver stopped twice. The first time to rest the mule and drink from a flask he kept under the seat. The second time, when one of the cart's wheels hit a deep rut, and they had to wait while he worked it free, with a wooden lever by lantern light. Mei Lin sat very still both times, and watched him work, and said nothing. She had learned early that silence made people forget you were there, and that people who forgot you were there often said and did things that were very informative. During the second stop, while the driver was wedging the lever under the wheel, two men on foot passed along the road. She heard them mention the name Du Ye and the estate, and she listened as carefully as she could. What she heard was that the estate was large, with stone walls and a proper gate, and that the landowner, Du Ye, was a widower who had 2 sons and a daughter who had all moved to cities and rarely returned. One of the men said Du Ye was a serious person who did not talk much, but who was said to be decent, which in the context of their conversation seemed to mean that he paid people what he had agreed to pay them, and did not find excuses to reduce the amount later. She filed this away in her mental drawers, and was quiet again, when the driver climbed back onto the cart. They arrived at the estate in the early hours before dawn. She could not see it well in the dark, only the shape of the outer wall, which was long and gray and solid, and the wooden gate at the front, which was large, and had 2 lanterns hung beside it, that were still burning with a low, steady light. The driver stopped at the gate and called out, and after a moment, a smaller door set into the gate was opened by a middle-aged woman holding a lamp. The woman's name was Mrs. Zhao. Mei Lin would learn this in the morning, but for now, Mrs. Zhao was just a face above a lamp and a brisk, no-nonsense voice telling the driver where to put the cart. Then, Mrs. Zhao held the lamp out and looked at Mei Lin for a long moment without speaking, taking in her cloth bag and her position on the floor of the cart. Mei Lin looked back at her without flinching. Mrs. Zhao said simply that the sleeping quarters were through the second courtyard on the left, that breakfast was at sunrise, and that Du Ye would speak with her in the afternoon. Then she reached out to help Mei Lin down from the cart. Mei Lin did not need help getting down from a cart. She had been getting herself into and out of various vehicles, furniture, and floor-level situations her entire life, and she had a system that worked efficiently. But she understood that Mrs. Zhao was offering the gesture in good faith, so she accepted it, placing one hand in the older woman's, for just the last moment of the descent, as a small acknowledgement of the kindness behind it. Mrs. Zhao led her through the gate, with the lamp swinging gently, and Mei Lin moved at her side across the stone courtyard, taking in as much as she could in the dim light. She saw the shapes of several buildings arranged around an open space. She saw flower pots stacked along one wall. She saw a well with a wooden cover. She saw a cat sitting on top of a low wall, watching them pass, with calm, golden eyes. The sleeping room was small and clean. There was a low sleeping platform, a blanket that smelled of cedar, and a small window that let in a thread of night air. Mrs. Zhao set a cup of water on the ledge near the door and said goodnight, and left without ceremony. Mei Lin sat on the sleeping platform and looked at the room. She looked at the ceiling, which did not leak. She looked at the window, which had a proper frame. She pressed her hand against the blanket and felt its weight. It was the heaviest blanket she had ever had to herself. She lay down. The sleeping platform was slightly too high for her to reach easily from the floor, but she had managed the transfer without trouble. She pulled the blanket up. She listened to the quiet of the estate, which was a different kind of quiet than the village. Fuller somehow, like a room that had been lived in for a long time. She thought about her mother, standing in the doorway with her hands pressed together. She thought about the cart rolling away around the corner. Then she closed her eyes and slept, because she had learned a long time ago that resting well was the first step to doing anything well, and tomorrow was going to be a long and important day. She was right about both things. She woke before sunrise, washed her face in the small basin that had been left in the corner of the room, changed into her better pair of clothes, and made her way through the courtyard toward the smell of cooking. The kitchen was a long room off the eastern side of the main courtyard, with a big clay stove and shelves stacked with earthenware pots and jars. 2 other women were already there, one stoking the fire and one chopping vegetables. They both looked up when she came in. She said good morning to both of them, and then settled herself in a corner near the fire, where she was out of the way, but could see everything that was happening. This was her method. She never walked into a new situation demanding attention. She arrived, found a quiet place from which she could observe, and watched until she understood the shape of things. Only then did she begin to act. The 2 women were named Hong and Pearl. Hong was older, somewhere in her 40s, with a wide, calm face and slow movements that suggested she had been doing this particular work for many years. Pearl was younger, maybe 19 or 20, quick and a little nervous, with the look of someone who was still figuring out her place. They fed Mei Lin a bowl of congee and a piece of pickled vegetable, without making any fuss about it, and she ate and watched and listened. By the time breakfast was finished and cleared, she had learned that the estate had 8 permanent workers, including herself now. She had learned that Mrs. Zhao was the person who ran the household on a daily basis. She had learned that there was a man named Old Wu, who managed the fields and the outer buildings. She had learned that Du Ye ate his meals alone, and that he worked in his study in the mornings, and walked the property in the afternoons. And she had learned that everyone was a little afraid of Du Ye, not because he was harsh, but because he was quiet and observant, and they never quite knew what he was thinking. She was still thinking about this when Mrs. Zhao came to find her, after the morning cleaning was done, and told her that Du Ye would see her now. He was standing in the courtyard near the well when she came out. This was not where she had expected to find him. She had expected a study, a desk, a man seated behind something. Instead, he was simply standing in the morning light with his arms at his sides, looking at the gate. He was taller than most men she had seen, not young, but not yet old, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work. His hands were large and capable-looking. He wore plain clothes, nothing that announced his status. When he heard her moving across the stone of the courtyard, he turned and looked at her, not at her legs, or at the manner of her movement. He looked at her face. He said good morning. She said good morning back. He said her name, Mei Lin, and asked if she had slept well. She said she had, and that the room was comfortable and the blanket was warm, and that she was grateful for both. He nodded, as if this was exactly the kind of answer he had expected. Then he said, simply, that he hoped she would find the estate a fair place to live and work, that he expected diligence and honesty from everyone who worked for him, that in return, they would be treated with respect and provided for properly, and that if she ever had a concern or a difficulty, she was to come directly to him or to Mrs. Zhao, and it would be addressed. She looked at him steadily while he said all this, and she thought about the cart driver who had not looked at her, and her father who had gone inside without saying goodbye, and the careful, rehearsed words her mother had given her as a parting gift. And then she thought about this man, standing in a courtyard in plain clothes, looking directly at her face, speaking to her, as though what she thought and felt mattered. She said, quietly but clearly, that she understood, and that she intended to work hard and learn quickly, and that she hoped to be useful to the household. He looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes. Then, very slightly, he nodded. And that was the beginning of everything. The weeks that followed were the busiest of her life. She had never lived in a place with so many things happening at once, so many people moving in and out, so many tasks being managed simultaneously. The estate was not just a house. It was a small working world, with its own rhythms and rules and requirements, and she threw herself into learning all of them, with an intensity that surprised even Mrs. Zhao. She learned where everything was stored. She learned which supplier gave fair weight and which one liked to put the heaviest items at the top of the sack, to make the whole thing feel heavier than it was. She learned which of the field workers finished early, and which ones needed watching to make sure the work was done properly. She learned that Du Ye drank his tea without sugar, and liked it steeped for exactly the right amount of time, and that if it was too light or too dark, he would say nothing, but would leave most of it in the cup. She paid attention to all of it. She remembered all of it. And slowly, steadily, the estate began to feel like something that was partly hers, not because anyone had given it to her, but because she had worked to understand every corner of it, and in understanding it, she had made herself necessary to it. She did not know yet what that would mean. She did not know yet what was coming. But she was 16 years old. She had been carried through a dark gate into an unfamiliar world, and she was, for the first time in her life, somewhere that had not yet decided what she could not do. That was more than enough to begin with. In the second month of her time at the estate, something happened that changed the way people there looked at her. It began with a mistake in the grain accounts. The estate bought grain from 4 different suppliers each season, and the records of these purchases were kept in a large cloth-covered ledger that lived on a shelf in Mrs. Zhao's office, which was a small room off the main kitchen. The ledger was old and had been maintained by a succession of people over the years, and the handwriting changed several times within it, which made it difficult to read in places. But the numbers were supposed to be accurate. They were not. Mei Lin discovered this in the middle of a quiet afternoon, when Mrs. Zhao had asked her to check the figures from the autumn delivery against what was actually stored in the grain room. It was a routine task, the kind of thing that needed doing every few months, to make sure nothing had been taken or spoiled, and Mrs. Zhao had given it to her, because Mei Lin was fast with numbers and could be trusted to do it carefully. Mei Lin had been sitting on the floor of the grain room for about an hour, running down the columns in the ledger and comparing them to what was in front of her, when she found the error. It was not small. Someone, at some point in the past 2 years, had been recording larger deliveries than what was actually arriving. The difference, added up across several months, was significant enough to matter. She sat very still for a moment, looking at the numbers. This was a delicate situation. She was new. She was the youngest person on the estate. She had not been given any authority over anything beyond the tasks she was assigned each day, and she had just discovered what looked very much like a serious problem in the records of a household that had been running this way for years before she arrived. She could ignore it. She could tell herself it was not her problem. She could close the ledger, complete the simple version of the task she had been given, and say nothing. She thought about this for exactly as long as it took to add up the numbers one more time to be sure. Then she went to find Du Ye. She found him in the main courtyard, speaking with old Wu about a section of the wall that needed repair. She waited at a respectful distance until there was a pause in the conversation, and then she said, quietly, that she needed to show him something when he had a moment. He looked at her. Old Wu looked at her. She held the ledger against her chest and waited. Du Ye said he would come in a few minutes. He came in less than a minute. She laid the ledger out on the long table in the storage room and showed him the columns. She explained what she had found without speculation, without emotion, and without accusation. She showed him the numbers that had been recorded, and the numbers that were actually present, and she showed him how the gap had developed over time. She did not say who had made the error, or whether it was deliberate. She only showed him what the records showed, and what the grain room showed, and the difference between the two. He stood very still while she talked. When she finished, he did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the grain room. He looked at the ledger again. Then he looked at her and said, How did you find this? She said she had been adding the figures while checking the delivery records against what was in storage, and the total had not matched, and so she had gone back through the previous entries to find where the gap had started. He said, "How long did it take you to find it?" She said, "About an hour." He was quiet again. Then he said, in a careful voice, that he would look into the matter, and that she had done the right thing in bringing it to him, and that he was grateful. She said she was sorry if it caused difficulty. He said it would cause less difficulty now than it would have caused later. That evening, after dinner, Mrs. Zhao came to find her in the small room off the kitchen, where she usually spent her evenings with a piece of mending or a book. Mrs. Zhao sat down on the stool near the door and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. Then she said, "You are not what I expected." Mei Lin looked up from the mending in her hands and waited. Mrs. Zhao said she had been running households for a long time. She had worked for 3 different families over the years. She had seen a great many young people arrive at estates like this one and behave in various ways. Some worked hard, some were lazy, some were timid, some were troublesome. But she had not, in a long time, seen someone as young as Mei Lin, and as new, find something that had been wrong for 2 years and walk directly to the person who needed to know it. Most people, she said, would have been afraid. Mei Lin said she had thought about being afraid, but she had decided that the cost of saying nothing was higher than the cost of saying something. Mrs. Zhao looked at her for another moment, then she nodded once, in the way of someone who has reached a conclusion they are satisfied with, and stood up to leave. At the door, she paused and said, "Du Ye noticed." Then she left. Mei Lin set down her mending and sat with that for a while. She looked at the small square of mirror she had brought from home, propped on the ledge above her sleeping area, and she looked at her own face in it. She looked tired, she looked young, she looked, she thought, like someone who was very far from the village where she had grown up, sitting in a room she had not expected to be in, having a conversation she had not imagined having, in a life she had not known was waiting for her. She thought about her mother. She thought about the courtyard at home, and the dust in the lane, and the ants carrying crumbs across the earthen floor. She picked up her mending again. There was still plenty of it left to do, and the lamplight was still good, and the night was quiet around her, and she was, she realized, not afraid. She was, in some way she could not yet fully name, beginning. The cold season arrived early that year. By the 10th month, the mornings had frost on the stones of the courtyard, and the kitchen fire was lit before sunrise every day, to keep the rooms warm enough to work in. The estate settled into the slower rhythm of winter, when outdoor work reduced and indoor tasks expanded, and people spent more time in the same rooms together, which meant that the small details of character and habit became more visible. Mei Lin used the winter to learn. She had already absorbed the practical workings of the household, the supply schedules, the account books, the preferences and routines of everyone who lived and worked there. But what she turned her attention to now was something less visible and more important, which was the way things were decided, and why. She noticed that Du Ye consulted old Wu about any matter involving the fields or the outer buildings, but made decisions about the household himself, after speaking with Mrs. Zhao. She noticed that when there was a disagreement between 2 of the workers, it was usually resolved not by a direct confrontation, but by a quiet conversation with one of the older workers first, and that this approach almost always worked better than arguing the thing out in front of everyone. She noticed that the suppliers who were treated with courtesy and given tea when they arrived always seemed to bring slightly better quality goods than those who were received at the gate and sent on their way quickly. She noticed all of this, and she thought about it, and she added it to everything else she was learning. She was also learning to read better. She had taught herself to read as a child, using her brother's school primers and a dog-eared copy of a folk story collection that had belonged to her grandmother. Her reading was functional, but uneven. She could get through most things, but slowly, with effort. The estate had books, real ones, more than she had ever seen in one place, on a shelf in the corridor near Du Ye's study. She had looked at them many times in passing, and had wanted to touch them and open them and read them, but had not done so, because they were not hers, and she had not been given permission. One morning in early winter, Du Ye found her standing in front of that shelf, with her hand just barely not touching the spine of one of the books. She had not heard him come up behind her, and when he spoke, she startled. He said, "You can read them if you want." She looked at him. He was standing with a cup of tea in his hand, looking at the shelf rather than at her, as if they were both simply people looking at some books together. She said she did not want to presume. He said he bought books to be read, not to sit on a shelf. Then he went into his study and closed the door quietly behind him. She took the book down from the shelf. It was a collection of historical accounts, stories of emperors and generals and court decisions and wars, written in language that was sometimes difficult but always eventually clear, if she was patient with it. She read it in the evenings after her work was done, and then she read the next one, and the next. She read about the building of canals, and the management of floods, and the way grain stores had been managed during drought years, by administrators, who understood that the difference between order and catastrophe was often just one season's careful planning. She read about women who had managed large households in the old dynasties, and she read about those households with the same attention she gave to the estate around her, noting what had worked, and what had failed, and why. She was, without quite knowing she was doing it, educating herself for a life she could not yet see clearly, but was already beginning to build. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the quiet, and the cold, and the lamplight, and the turning of pages, something else was also happening. Something she was not yet ready to look at directly, but it was there, growing in the space between the daily tasks and the evening reading and the mornings in the courtyard, in the steady, particular way that real things grow, slowly and without announcement and without asking permission. It had begun, she thought later. On the morning Douillet had told her to take whatever book she wanted from the shelf, and had then gone into his study and closed the door, not because he did not want to speak to her, but because he trusted her to be in the corridor alone with his things, and that trust was the kind of thing that, once given, changed the shape of a room forever. She read the books and did her work, and watched the frost form on the courtyard stones each morning, and she was 16 years old, in a world that had never intended to give her much, and she was making of it something the world had not anticipated, and that too was just the beginning. By the time the spring came, Mei Lin had been at the estate for nearly half a year. The frost had gone from the courtyard stones, and the plum tree in the eastern corner had gone from bare branches to small white flowers overnight, the way it always did, startling everyone who had forgotten over the winter that the tree was capable of such a thing. She sat under the plum tree on a clear morning, with a ledger open in her lap and the light coming through the white flowers above her, and thought about how different everything was from what she had expected. She had expected to be invisible. She had expected to be given the least important tasks and ignored in most conversations. She had expected to spend her days here the way she had spent them at home, managing what she could and accepting what she could not. Instead, Mrs. Zhao had given her the account books entirely. Instead, Douillet spoke to her in the courtyard, as a matter of course, asking what she had noticed about the household, what she thought about a particular supplier, whether she had seen any sign of the problem with the northern granary wall she had mentioned in passing 2 weeks ago. Instead, Hong and Pearl came to her when they had questions about orders and schedules, not because anyone had told them to, but because they had noticed, in the practical and immediate way of people who work closely together, that she was the one most likely to have the answer. She had not asked for any of this. She had simply done what was in front of her to do, and paid attention, and been honest. And now this was where she was. The morning of the plum tree was also the morning a visitor came to the estate for the first time since she had arrived. His name was Douillet's distant cousin, a man called Lian, who arrived on horseback from a county further east, with 2 companions, and a great deal of noise and expectation. He was broad and loud, and had the comfortable manner of a man who had never had a reason to question his own importance. He swept into the estate courtyard and called for tea and refreshment, and announced that he would be staying for 3 days and required the large guest room. Mei Lin watched all of this from a quiet distance, and then went to Mrs. Zhao to confirm the guest room arrangements. Mrs. Zhao looked tired already. She said Lian was always like this. Mei Lin said she had worked that out. They looked at each other with the kind of understanding that passes between 2 people who have both dealt with a great many self-important visitors, and then they went to prepare the guest room. At dinner that evening, Lian sat across from Douillet and talked for most of the meal about various enterprises he was involved in, and the difficulties they were presenting him with. all of which seemed to have in common the theme that other people were not as capable as himself. Mei Lin served tea with Hong and listened without appearing to listen. At one point, Lian noticed her. This happened in the middle of a sentence, and he did not stop the sentence, but his eyes followed her across the room in the way of a man who has categorized something and filed it away for potential future use. She noticed him noticing and gave no sign of it. After dinner, when she and Hong were clearing the table and Du Ye and Lian had gone to the study, she heard voices through the closed door. She was not trying to listen, but the door was old and the wall was thin, and Lian's voice was not a voice designed for discretion. She heard him ask, with a particular kind of lightness in his tone that carried its own heaviness underneath it, whether Du Yi intended to keep the girl with the legs long term, or whether she was a temporary arrangement. Whether was a silence. Then Du Ye said, in the particular quiet of his voice that she had learned meant he was being very precise, that Mei Lin was a permanent and valuable member of his household, and that her position here was not a temporary arrangement. Du Ye said, she does more in a morning than most people manage in a day. I would suggest you form your opinion of people based on what they do, rather than what they look like when they are doing it. After that, the voices dropped too low to hear. She stood in the corridor with the tray in her hands, and the sound of those words settling into her like something very heavy and very good, and she breathed carefully for a moment, and then she went back to the kitchen and washed the cups. She told no one what she had heard. It was not for sharing. It was hers, a small, private truth that she carried with her into the days that followed, into the spring light and the account books and the ordering of supplies and the conversations in the courtyard. It was the first time in her life that someone who had a choice had chosen to say that she was valuable, and had said it plainly, to someone who had suggested otherwise. She was not sure yet what to do with that, but she knew, with the certainty she had learned to trust in herself, that it mattered. It mattered in the way that a foundation matters when you are building something. You cannot always see it, but everything else depends on it being there. The plum tree dropped its flowers across the courtyard stones in the following week, pale and brief and very beautiful, and she was 17 years old now, and the world she was building for herself, quietly and carefully in the courtyard of this estate, was beginning to take a shape she recognized. She did not know yet what she was going to build, but she knew she was going to build something, and she knew, in the way you know the things that matter most, that she was in the right place to do it. The summer brought more visitors, more deliveries, and a new problem. The grain merchant from the northern village had begun sending short measures. It was not obvious. The sacks looked full. The weight on each one was close enough to correct that you would have to be measuring carefully to notice. But Mei Lin had been measuring carefully for months, and she noticed the difference on each sack was small. But the estate was buying from this merchant every 2 weeks, and over several months the accumulated shortage was significant. She went to Du Ye on a Tuesday morning, after he had finished his morning tea, and before he had started on the day's correspondence, which was the window she had learned was the best time to bring him something that required his full attention. She spread her records on the table in the study, which was the first time she had been in the study, and she showed him the measurements and the dates and the accumulating difference. That he looked at the records for a long time, then he looked at her. He said, "How long have you been keeping these?" She said, "Since the 3rd month of her time here," when she had noticed the first discrepancy and decided to record it rather than assuming it was an accident before she had enough information to be sure. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You waited 4 months to bring this to me." She said she had wanted to be certain before she said anything that could not be unsaid. He looked at her with those steady, careful eyes. Then he said, "That was the right decision." They dealt with the merchant calmly and directly. Du Yi sent a letter laying out the documented discrepancies and indicating that the estate would be purchasing from a different supplier going forward, unless the matter was addressed in full. The merchant came in person 3 days later with a revised account and an apology, and Du Ye received him politely but without warmth, and the account was settled, and after that, the measures were always correct. What stayed with Mei Lin from this episode was not the resolution. It was the moment in the study when Du Ye had said, that was the right decision. Because what he meant, she understood, was not just that the decision to wait had been tactically correct. He meant that the way she had thought about it, carefully, over time, with evidence, before speaking, was the right way to think about things. And that was a different kind of approval from being told you were useful or that your work was satisfactory. It was approval of the way her mind worked. And the way her mind worked was the thing she had always been most certain of, the thing she had relied on when everything else had been taken away or withheld. And to have someone see it clearly and say plainly that it was good was something she had not known how to want, because she had not known it was possible. Summer moved through its heat and into the cooler edge of early autumn. She was 17 and a half. She had been at the estate for more than a year. She knew the names of everyone who worked there, and several details about each person that she had gathered through the simple practice of paying attention. Hong's youngest child was starting to walk. Pearl was quietly hoping to be courted by the son of the Eastern field worker. Old Wu's right shoulder gave him trouble when the weather turned wet, and Mrs. Zhao kept a small piece of embroidery in her pocket that she worked on in any spare minute and never mentioned to anyone. She knew these things because she watched and listened and kept her own counsel, and because she had discovered, in the months here, that knowing people well was the same thing as caring for them, and that caring for people, even in the quiet and invisible ways, was the thing that made a household run with a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the rooms. She was building something here, not something she could name yet, not something she could point to and explain, but something real and growing, in the way that real things grow, not with drama or announcement, but with time and attention and the steady, faithful showing up of every day. She did not know yet how far this building would take her. She did not know yet what was coming, in the form of her father at the gate, and a proposal in the evening, and a revolution at the walls. She did not know yet that the life she was making would be tested in ways she could not currently imagine. But she was ready for it, in the way that people are ready who have been paying attention all along, which is the only way that actually works. And the autumn came in golden and cool around the estate walls, and the plum tree in the corner held its bare branches up to the sky, and she was 17 years old in a world that had intended to give her nothing, and she had made of it, already, more than that world had planned. She would make more still. The morning her father appeared at the estate gate was a morning like any other, which is what made it so strange. It was 3 years after the cart had rolled away from the village in the dark. She was 19 now, not 16. She had grown in ways that had nothing to do with her body, and everything to do with what she had learned. She ran the household accounts entirely. She managed the supply schedules without supervision. She had trained Pearl in the correct method of receiving and verifying deliveries, and Pearl was now good at it. She had worked out a system for the grain stores that had saved the estate 2 seasons' worth of spoilage. She was in the main kitchen, with Mrs. Zhao, going over the winter preparation list, when old Wu came in and said, in the careful tone of someone delivering news they are not sure will be welcome, that there was a man at the gate asking for Mei Lin. He said it was her father. She set down the list. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had imagined this moment before, in the way you imagine things that have not happened, and are not certain to happen, but that you know are possible. She had imagined anger. She had imagined something like grief. Instead, what she felt was simply clear, like a room, when all the furniture has been moved to one side, and you can see exactly how large it is. She told Mrs. Zhao she would be in the eastern courtyard, and she moved out through the kitchen door, and along the covered walkway to the courtyard, where visitors were received. Lin Bao was standing near the entrance, turning his cap in his hands. He was older than she remembered, more worn. The 3 years since she had seen him had pressed themselves into his face in the particular way of hard years in a hard place. He looked up when she came into the courtyard and for a moment just looked at her, taking in the changes that 3 years had made. She settled onto the low receiving stool that she used for meetings, the one placed on a raised stone platform so that she was at a comfortable height for conversation. She looked at him and said, "Hello." He said hello. He said she was looking well. She said she was, and asked after her mother. He said Su Hua was fine. Then there was a pause, in which she could see him finding his way toward what he had come to say. What he had come to say was this. He had found a man who wanted a wife. The man was a cousin of a neighbor in Changpu, a farmer from 3 villages away, a widower, with 2 young children, who needed someone to manage the home. Lin Bao had been given to understand that the man would take Mei Lin, despite her condition. If the arrangement was right, there would be a small payment, A second chance, Lin Bao said, as if this was a gift. He was, she understood, here to take her home and sell her again. She sat with this for a moment. The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere on the other side of the estate, she could hear the sound of someone chopping wood. Then she said, in a voice that was very even and very clear, that she was not going. Lin Bao blinked. He said the arrangement was already discussed. She said it had been discussed without her, and she was no longer a person whose arrangements could be made without her. He said, in the tone of a man beginning to understand that something has changed but not yet accepting it, that she did not have a choice in this. She was still his daughter. She said she was his daughter, yes, and she always would be. But her life was here now. She had work here, a position here, people who depended on her. She was not leaving. She could see in his face the beginning of the argument that would have followed. She could see him measuring the distance between what he wanted and what was actually possible, and she waited for him to measure it. Then she heard the sound of footsteps on the stone behind her, and she knew without turning that Du Yi had come into the courtyard. She had not asked him to be there. She had not known he was nearby. He came in quietly and stood a little to one side, not directly behind her, not interfering, simply present. He did not speak. He did not make any gesture that was aggressive or threatening. He simply stood there, with his hands at his sides, and his quiet, steady eyes on Lin Bao. Lin Bao looked at Du Ye. He looked at Mei Lin. He looked at Du Ye again. The measuring stopped. Lin Bao turned his cap in his hands one more time. Then he said, in a smaller voice, that he had only come to make sure she was all right. She said she knew. He said her mother asked about her often. She said to tell her mother she was well and was thinking of her. He nodded. He looked around the courtyard once more, taking in the stone walls and the tile roofing and the well and the carefully swept ground, and she could see him understanding, in the way that people understand when the evidence is right in front of them, that wherever his daughter was now, it was a different place from the place he had sent her from. He left without further argument. She heard the gate close behind him. She sat for a moment in the quiet courtyard. Then she said, without turning, "Thank you for being there." The Du Ye said he had only come to tell her there was a letter from the supply house, but that it could wait. She turned and looked at him then. He was still standing to one side, as unhurried as always, and she thought about the night she had arrived here, and the morning, in the courtyard when he had said good morning and looked at her face, and the moment in the corridor with the books, and the study with the ledger, and the evening in the kitchen after the grain account, all the small moments that had built themselves into this one, and she said, I know what it was." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once, and went back toward the study, and she sat in the courtyard alone in the quiet afternoon, and breathed. She was 19 years old. She had just told her father that her life was hers. She had been believed. That was the day, she would think later, that she fully understood she was free. The letter from the supply house could wait, but a great many other things could not. The autumn that year was busier than usual. 3 of the field workers needed replacing, because 2 had left for city work, and 1 had injured his back. And the replacement process was complicated, because skilled field workers were increasingly hard to find in the county. The outer wall needed significant repair in 2 sections. A dispute between the estate and a neighboring farmer over a boundary marker that had been in the wrong position for 20 years finally became urgent when the neighboring farmer planted right up to the disputed line and left no room for the access path the estate had always used. Mei Lin handled all of it. She handled the worker replacements by speaking directly with families in 3 neighboring villages, the kind of careful personal conversation that produced better results than any written notice. She handled the wall repair by negotiating with a builder in the local town who gave them a better price in exchange for agreeing to pay on delivery rather than asking for credit. And she handled the boundary dispute by going into the county records herself, a process that took 3 trips to the records office and a great deal of patience with an elderly clerk who could not understand why a young woman with unusual manner of movement was asking about boundary documents, and discovering that the original survey from 40 years earlier clearly supported the estate's position, and presenting this information to Du Ye in a 1-page summary. Du Ye, read the summary. He looked at the survey copy she had obtained. He said, "Did you go to the records office yourself?" She said she had. He said, "3 times?" She said the clerk had been slow to find the right files. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would deal with the neighboring farmer directly, using the documentation she had found, and that the matter should be resolved quickly. It was. Within a week, the boundary marker was moved to its correct position, the access path was restored, and the neighboring farmer sent a sack of autumn vegetables to the estate, which was the local way of acknowledging that an argument was over. She had not expected the vegetables. She looked at them for a moment, and then gave them to Hong for the kitchen, and said nothing further about it. What she noticed, in the weeks after the boundary matter, was that something had shifted in the way Duye spoke to her. He had always been respectful, always treated her as someone whose opinion mattered, but there was something new now, something she noticed in the way a conversation lengthened sometimes when it did not need to, when the practical matter had been settled and there was no particular reason to keep talking, and yet the talking continued, moving into territory that had nothing to do with accounts or schedules or boundary markers, and everything to do with the kind of talking that happens between people who find each other interesting. She noticed this and was careful about it. She was careful not because she wanted to close the door on it, but because she had learned that the most important things required the most care, and that the wrong step in the wrong direction could close a door that there was not a second chance to reopen. So she was careful. She listened. She answered honestly when he asked her things. She did not pretend to opinions she did not have, and she did not exaggerate the ones she did. When he asked her one evening, in the middle of a conversation about the records office, what she thought she wanted from her life in the long term, she sat with the question for long enough to actually think about it, and then she said, "I want to be useful, and I want to be here." And he had looked at her with those quiet eyes and said, "I think that can be arranged." She had not known exactly what he meant, but she had known that the words were not entirely about the household, and she had understood, in the part of herself that understood things before her mind had finished working them out, that the conversation she was in was a different conversation from any she had been in before. And she had been, for the first time she could remember, not afraid of what was coming. The proposal came in winter. It came on an evening when the courtyard was cold and quiet, and the lanterns along the walkway were lit, and she was sitting in the study going over the month's accounts while Duye read at the other end of the table, which had become, over the months, a perfectly ordinary and comfortable arrangement. They worked in the same room often now. They were both people who could work quietly in the presence of someone else, and this had turned out to be a rare and comfortable thing to share. He looked up from his reading. He said her name. She looked up. He said he had been thinking about something for a long time, and that he wanted to say it plainly, because she was a person who appreciated plainness. She waited. He said he was not a man who needed to be managed. He was not a man who needed to be entertained. He was not a man who needed anything dramatic or complicated. What he needed, he said, was someone who understood things, not just the accounts and the supplies and the practical working of a household, though that was important, and she did it better than anyone he had ever known. He meant understanding in the deeper sense, understanding that came from paying attention and thinking carefully and being honest, even when honesty was not the comfortable choice. He said she was the most intelligent person he knew, and the most practical, and the most honest, and he had been in the company of a great many people in his life, and he had not said those things about any of them. Then he said, "I would like you to be my wife, if you are willing." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. She looked at his steady face, and his patient eyes, and the hands that had lifted her from a cart on the first night, in the dark, without drama, simply because it was the right thing to do. She said she needed 3 days to think. He said, "Of course." She spent the 3 days reading. She did this not because she was uncertain about what she wanted, but because she needed to think about what it meant to want it, and she thought best through reading. She found a passage in a book about the history of household management in the old dynasties that talked about what it meant to enter into a partnership freely, as opposed to being placed in one, and she read that passage many times. On the morning of the 3rd day, she got up early and sat in the courtyard under the bare plum tree in the cold air, and she thought about her mother and about Lin Bao's hand on the cloth package in the dark. She thought about the cart rolling away around the corner. She thought about being 16 years old with a cloth bag and 2 pairs of clothes and a pencil and 3 sheets of paper. sitting in the back of a cart in the dark, on a road she did not know, going to a place she had never seen. She thought about the man who had been standing at the gate in plain clothes, who had lifted her from the cart and set her down carefully and said, "You will be treated well here." He had kept that promise for 3 years. She had seen no reason to think he would stop, and she went to find him after breakfast. He was in the courtyard, which was where she had expected him to be. She said, "Yes, I am willing." He looked at her for a moment with the quiet of someone who has waited patiently for something that matters, and who, having received it, does not need to show it loudly. He said, "Good." And that, as simply as that, was how it was decided. They were married, in the early spring, quietly, with only the household present. Pearl cried a little, which she later said was because she was happy, and Hong made a wedding dish of red eggs and sweet rice, and old Wu gave a short speech that was heartfelt and slightly confused, but deeply meant. Mrs. Zhao stood to one side, with her arms folded and her face doing the thing it did, when she was pleased, but did not intend to say so directly. Du Ye's children were not there, they had been told, and they had responded with letters that were polite and measured and not warm. She had read the letters when he showed them to her without comment, and then she had said, simply, that people came around in their own time or they did not, and that in either case, the life being built here was real and was not dependent on their approval to become what it was. He had looked at her when she said this, and his expression had been the one she had come to recognize as the expression of a person who has just been told something true in the clearest possible way. She was 20 years old when they married. She had been sold for 2 sacks of millet and a cloth package of coins 4 years earlier, and now she was in a kitchen, eating red eggs and sweet rice, with people she had chosen and who had chosen her, and the plum tree in the eastern corner was flowering again, pale and brief and very beautiful, and outside the walls of the estate the world continued to be what it was, full of difficulty and change and things no one could entirely predict. She did not know yet what was coming through those walls. She did not know yet about the revolution, or the soldiers at the gate, or the years that would test everything she had built. She only knew what she could see, the courtyard in the spring light, the people around her, the life she had made from a cloth bag and a pencil and 3 sheets of paper, and the decision, made in the back of a cart in the dark, to be fine. She held her cup of tea, and she looked at her husband across the table, and he looked back at her, and neither of them needed to say what they were both thinking, because they were people who understood things. And the year moved forward, and the spring light moved across the courtyard stones, and she was Mei Lin, and she was here, and she was exactly where she had decided to be. The revolution did not arrive all at once. That was the thing about it that people later had trouble explaining to those who had not lived through it. It did not come like a storm, sudden and obvious. It came the way water changes stone, gradually, over time, in ways that seemed small individually, but added up to something that could reshape everything. She had been married 2 years when she first understood that the changes outside the estate walls were not temporary. The signs had been there for a while. The way certain topics disappeared from conversation in the market. The way some families in the nearby villages moved without telling anyone in advance, and then were simply not there anymore. The way the name of the county official changed twice in 1 year, without any explanation anyone would give directly. The way old Wu came in from the fields one afternoon, looking careful in a way he did not usually look, and said, when she asked him directly, that there had been men asking questions in the village about families who owned property. That was when she started preparing the papers. She did not tell Du Ye at first. She did not want to alarm him with a preparation that might not be necessary, and she was not certain herself exactly what she was preparing for. She only knew that the gap between what was being said officially and what was actually happening was widening in a way that her careful, observant mind had learned to treat as a warning sign. She began by going back through the estate's records. She organized everything into a clear and accurate account of how the household operated, who worked there, what they were paid, what the estate produced, how the land was managed. She wrote it all out in clean, formal language, the kind of language that appeared in official documents, and she made multiple copies of the most important parts and kept them in different places. She made note of which of the estate's activities could be described in terms that fit the current political categories, and which could not. The grain production, the vegetable gardens, the small orchard. These were things that fed people, and could be described as community contributions. The decorative elements of the estate, the carved wooden gates, the ornamental pots, the old furniture in the main rooms, these were things that would be looked at differently now, and she began quietly moving the most obvious pieces into storage rooms that were less visible. She did this methodically, over the course of several months, without creating alarm or discussion. She told Hong and Pearl and Old Wu only what they needed to know to help with the immediate task at hand, framing each thing as a practical household matter, rather than a response to a threat. She was not wrong to be careful. She was, as she usually was, right on time. The morning the group arrived at the gate was a morning in late summer, the air thick and hot, and the courtyard almost completely still. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of several people approaching the gate at once, the particular sound of a group that has purpose and urgency behind it. She was in the kitchen. She told Hong to stay where she was. She told Pearl to go to the east room and remain there. Then she moved to the front courtyard. There were 7 of them, young, most of them, wearing the red-banded armbands that she recognized from what she had heard about groups in other counties. They were led by a young man who looked about 20, with a voice that was too loud for the space it was filling. He announced, at the gate, that they had come to inspect the estate as part of the reorganization of property in the county. Du Ye came out of the study at the sound of voices. She felt, rather than saw him appear behind her, and she stepped slightly forward, which was, they both understood in that moment, the right thing to do. But she said good morning, in a clear and calm voice, and said she was glad they had come, because there were some papers she had prepared that would be helpful to them. The young leader stopped. This was not what he had expected. She said she understood the reorganization required documentation of all estate holdings and activities, and that she had prepared a complete accounting based on the county registry guidelines, and that she would be happy to go through it with them. She said she had also prepared a summary of the estate's contribution to the local food supply over the past 3 years, including the grain quantities that had been made available to the market and the workers' arrangements, which she believed they would find satisfactory. She said all of this in the same tone she used when talking to the supply house clerk about a delivery schedule. Matter-of-fact, cooperative, clear. The young leader looked at her. He looked at the papers she was holding. He looked at the courtyard behind her, which was clean and orderly, and full of nothing that invited confrontation. He said he would need to look at the papers. She said, of course, and suggested they move to the receiving room, where it would be more comfortable, and that she could have tea brought. They came inside. It took most of the morning. She went through everything with them, the accounts, the workers' records, the land use documentation, the contribution summaries. When they asked questions, she answered them directly, and showed them the supporting documentation. When they raised a point about the category of the estate's land use, she had the relevant county registry entry already marked and ready. By the end of the morning, there was nothing for them to act on. Everything was documented, everything was categorized, everything was in order. She had done the work they were supposed to be doing before they arrived to do it, and the effect of this was that there was simply nothing left for them to be urgent about. They left in the early afternoon. The young leader, on his way out, said the documentation was in order and that the estate would be noted in the county records accordingly. She said thank you, and saw them out, and came back into the courtyard, and sat down on the low stool, and was still for a moment. Du Ye came and stood near her. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "How long had you been preparing for that?" She said, "About 8 months." Another pause. He said, "You started preparing for that before I knew it was coming." She said she had thought it was possible it might come, and that being ready seemed better than not being ready. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, simply, "Yes." That evening, when the household had settled, and Hong and Pearl had gone to their rooms, and Old Wu had locked the outer gate, she and Du Ye sat in the courtyard, in the cooling air of the late summer evening, and she thought about all the things that had happened in this courtyard since the first night she had arrived here, and about the shape of the life she was in the middle of. She was 22 years old. She had kept this estate standing through something that had taken down much larger and longer established households in the county. She had done it with paper and clear language, and 8 months of careful preparation, and the ability to walk into a difficult room and be the most composed person in it. She had done it without standing up. She had done it from a low stool in the receiving room, with a stack of organized documents, and a clear voice, and a mind that had been paying attention to the world for as long as she could remember. She thought about her father, and the cloth package in the dark, and the price he had decided she was worth. She thought about what she was worth now, to this estate, to this household, to the people who lived in it and depended on it. The numbers did not compare. The years that followed, the summer of the red armbands, were both harder and quieter than any other years of her life. Harder, because the political climate did not settle quickly. There were more inspections, more reorganizations, more changes to the official categories of what could be owned and how. She spent months of those years navigating the requirements of new county administrations, preparing documents, attending meetings in the local town, where she was often the only woman present, and certainly the only person who arrived on a low wooden cart rather than on foot or horseback. She learned to read official language the way she had learned to read everything else, carefully, looking for the space between what was said and what was meant. Quieter, because Duyer's health began to change. It happened slowly. He had always been a man of careful habits and steady energy, and for a long time the changes were only visible to someone who knew him very well, which she did. He tired more easily. He spent more time in the study and less time walking the property. He developed a persistent cough in the cold months that took longer each year to resolve when the weather warmed. She watched this and said nothing to anyone. What she did, instead, was adjust the household around it so quietly that most people did not realize anything had changed. The heavier outdoor tasks that he had previously supervised were shifted to old Wu, in a way that appeared to be a natural evolution of the household management, rather than a response to anything specific. The meetings in town that required long travel were handled increasingly by her, which was, by this point, something no one questioned. She managed the estate through the remaining political difficulties, and through his illness, with the same method she had always used: pay attention, prepare, act when the time was right, and do not waste energy on anything that cannot be changed. He died in the spring of their 12th year of marriage. She was 32 years old. The household was very quiet in the days afterward. Ong and Pearl and old Wu, who had all been there since before her arrival, moved through the rooms with the careful, respectful silence of people who understood that grief was a private thing, and that the best way to support someone going through it was to make sure everything that needed to happen continued to happen. She was grateful for this. It was exactly what she would have done herself. His children came for the burial. They were polite, and more present than they had been in years, which she attributed to the fact that grief has a way of clarifying what matters, even for people who have spent a long time not letting themselves think about it. Duyer's eldest son, a man named Wei Dong, who worked in a government office in the provincial city, arrived the evening before the burial, and sat with her in the main room for a long time, and they talked about his father in the way of people who had both known someone well, but from different angles, and it was, she thought, the most honest conversation she had ever had with a member of Duyer's family. Wei Dong said, at one point, that his father had written about her often in his letters, that he had said she was the most capable person he had ever known, and that in the years of political difficulty, he had told Wei Dong that the estate was still standing because of her. She said that his father had always been generous. Wei Dong said he did not think his father had been saying it to be generous. He thought he had been saying it because it was true. She looked at Duyer's son and saw something of the father in his face, the same careful eyes, the same quality of attention, and she said, simply, that the estate had survived because it was worth surviving, and that his father had understood what was worth protecting, and had built something worth protecting, and that she had only helped to keep it standing. Wei Dong looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "He chose well." She looked at the courtyard through the open door, at the plum tree in the corner, at the old stone walls in the evening light. She said, "Yes, we both did." She ran the estate alone for 31 years after that. This was not a thing anyone had expected, including herself. But the year after Duyi died, when Wei Dong came back from the city to discuss what should happen to the estate and its operations, she laid out for him a clear plan for how it could continue to function, and be productive, and serve the county record requirements, and generate enough from its output to maintain itself, without drawing on any outside resources. And Wei Dong, who was his father's son in the way that mattered most, looked at the plan, and at the woman who had made it, and said she should continue as she saw fit. So she did. The estate changed in those years. China was changing, the whole country shifting toward a new way of organizing itself, and the estate changed with it. The large-scale farming gave way to a more varied operation. Some grain, some market vegetables, a small orchard, and eventually, a modest workshop where local women could come to do piecework on textile orders from a factory in the county seat. This last thing was her innovation, and it took several years to establish. But once it was running, it provided income and purpose for a dozen women from the surrounding villages, and she took a quiet, particular satisfaction in that. She did not advertise what she was or what she had done. The county knew her as the widow of Douillet, the woman who ran the estate, the one you went to if you had a question about county records or a dispute over land documents or a need for accurate accounts. She was known as capable and direct and somewhat difficult to surprise. She was known as someone who kept her word. Her granddaughter, a girl named Xiao Ling, came to live at the estate for one summer when she was 14, sent by Wei Dong because he thought the quiet and the routine would be good for her after a difficult year at school. Xiao Ling was quick and curious and initially bored by the estate, the way young people are bored by anything that moves at a rhythm different from what they expect. But she watched her grandmother for 2 weeks and then began following her on her morning rounds, asking questions about the accounts and the supply relationships and the history of the boundary dispute and the summer of the red armbands. And Mei Lin answered all of them with the same patience she had always applied to everything that mattered. Xiao Ling asked, one morning under the plum tree, how she had learned to do all of it. She said she had watched, and she had thought about what she saw, and she had written things down. Xiao Ling said, "But you learned to read yourself, right? From your brother's school books?" She said yes. Xiao Ling said, "That must have been hard." She said it had been fine. Anything you want to learn badly enough becomes possible if you have enough patience and enough time. Xiao Ling was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Were you afraid when your father sent you away?" She thought about this carefully. She thought about the back of the cart in the dark, and the road she did not know, and the cloth bag with 2 pairs of clothes, and a pencil, and 3 sheets of paper. She said, "I decided not to be." Xiao Ling said, "Is that possible? Can you just decide?" She looked at her granddaughter's young face, at the particular brightness of someone who is still figuring out the shape of the world, and she thought about what to say. She said, "You cannot always decide what happens to you, but you can almost always decide what to do about it, and the decision is the thing that matters. The rest follows from that." Xiao Ling looked at her for a long moment. Then she took out the small notebook she had been carrying all summer and wrote something in it. She did not ask what she had written. Xiao Ling. But later, when Xiao Ling went back to the city at the end of the summer, she left the notebook behind by accident. It sat on the ledge near the kitchen for a week before she opened it. When she did, she found that most of the pages were filled with the ordinary notes of a 14-year-old girl spending a summer in a quiet place. But at the very back, in her granddaughter's clear handwriting, were the words she had said under the plum tree. "You cannot always decide what happens to you, but you can almost always decide what to do about it." And underneath it, in Xiao Ling's own words, grandmother said this, "I want to remember it." She closed the notebook and set it back on the ledge, and she sat for a moment in the kitchen in the quiet of the afternoon, and she thought about a girl in the back of a cart in the dark, counting the things she knew. She had never thought of herself as someone who had wisdom to give. She had only ever thought of herself as someone who paid attention and tried to do the right thing with what she found. But here was her granddaughter, 60 years younger, writing down her words in a notebook to remember them. Here was the thing she had built without knowing she was building it, not the estate, not the accounts, not the supply schedules, or the boundary documents, or the workshop for the village women. Those were real, and they mattered. But this was something else. This was the part that would keep going after everything else had changed. She was an old woman now, though she did not think of herself that way. She was the same person she had always been, the girl from Changpu who had decided, in the back of a cart in the dark, to be fine. She had been fine. She had been better than fine, though she would not have said so to anyone directly. She had built a life from a cloth bag and a pencil. She had run an estate through revolutions and inspections and grief and change. She had loved a man who had seen her clearly and chosen her freely. and she had been seen and chosen in return. She had raised people around her who were capable and good, not because she had demanded it, but because she had shown them what it looked like. And now she was old, and the plum tree in the eastern corner was still there, flowering each spring and going bare each winter and coming back again, patient and faithful and beautiful, the way things do that are rooted deeply enough. She put Xiaoling's notebook back on the ledge. Then she went to check the evening accounts, because there was still work to do, and the lamp was still good, and the night was quiet around her, and she had never been the kind of person to stop before she was finished. She passed away in the winter of her 62nd year, in the room she had lived in for decades, in the estate she had kept standing, through everything the world had thrown at it. She was small and still and entirely herself to the last, which was the way of people who have known for a long time exactly who they are. The household was quiet for days after. The people who worked there, and the people from the neighboring villages who had known her, moved through those days with the careful dignity of people who understand that the right way to honor someone is to continue doing the things they cared about, which in this case meant checking the accounts and receiving the morning delivery with proper documentation and making sure the grain room was accurately measured. Wei Dong came from the city. He was old now, a retired man with a grandchild of his own, and he walked through the estate slowly and looked at everything with the eyes of someone taking a long, careful inventory of what a life had made. He said, to no one in particular, that she had kept it all standing. Old Wu, who was still there and still moving slowly through the outer courtyard even at his age, said, she kept more than that standing. Xiaoling was a physician in the city by then, and she came for the burial and stayed for a week afterward, and in the evenings, she sat in the courtyard with the old notebook she had left behind that summer, and the others she had filled over the years, and she wrote about her grandmother, with the same careful attention that her grandmother had given to everything. What she wrote was not a history, it was not a formal account, it was the story of a woman who had been given almost nothing, and had made almost everything, not through luck or through having the right circumstances, but through the steady, faithful practice of paying attention and deciding what to do with what she found. There was a photograph. It had been taken by a traveling photographer who had come through the county sometime in Mei Lin's 50s, and it showed her in the courtyard, on a clear day, seated on the low stool she had always used for meetings. Her posture was perfectly upright. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were looking directly at the camera, with the particular directness of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and is simply, entirely, present. She did not look like a woman who could not stand. She looked like a woman who did not need to. Xiaoling put this photograph on the cover of the account she wrote, and beneath it, she wrote a single line, not as a caption, but as a conclusion. She never stood, but no one in her life ever stood taller. The estate was still standing too. It was smaller now, the workshop having closed years before, the fields reduced to a modest plot that provided vegetables for the immediate household and a small amount for the local market. But the stone walls were solid. The gate still had 2 lanterns beside it that were lit in the evenings, and the plum tree in the eastern corner still flowered every spring without fail. The room where she had first slept, all those years ago, when she had arrived in the dark with a cloth bag and 2 pairs of clothes, was still a sleeping room, used now by whoever was newest to the household. The blanket had been replaced many times, but the cedar smell that had been in the first one had, through some long habit of the room, never entirely left. New people arriving for the first time in that room sometimes remarked on it, not knowing where the smell came from, or why it made the room feel, already, like somewhere they had been before. The accounts were kept in the same ledger format she had established decades earlier. The supply schedules were organized the same way. The method of receiving deliveries and checking measures against the documentation was the one she had trained into Pearl and Hong and the others who had come after them, and it had been passed forward in the patient, ordinary way that useful knowledge is passed forward, one careful person showing another. The plum tree flowered. The lanterns were lit each evening. The accounts were kept accurately and honestly, because that was what the estate did, and it was what it had always done. And the reason it had always done it was because of a woman who had arrived in the dark on the back of a cart with a cloth bag and a pencil, and who had decided, quietly and completely, and without any drama, to be fine. She had been more than fine. She had been, in the way that matters most and is hardest to measure and lasts the longest, extraordinary. And the estate was still standing, and the plum tree was still there, and the story was done.